We go over to the AM 560 Traffic Center now with Jim Talamonte.
It's been an awful morning for crashes and incidents. The outbound Eisenhower is closed. Ashland, Damon, after an alleged carjacking overnight and an incident in which police say a suspect fled into traffic and was struck. Traffic is at a standstill. The Burn Circle to Ashland, where everything is blocked outbound. Inbound, it's all open. Both long. The intersection of 95th and Ridgeland is shut down for major crash investigation. Report of shots fired. Wakanda 12 is closed in both directions south of 176 for major crash investigation. Eastbound Adams Tollway past Roselle Road, an earlier collision cleared. That's traffic. I'm Jim Talamonte on AM 560 The Answer.
More of Chicago's Morning Answer show comes your way next. Now your official Chicagoland weather forecast. Breezy today, otherwise cool with partial sunshine, high 62 degrees. Clear sky tonight, going down to 57. Tomorrow, mostly sunny, high temperature 65 degrees. Right now, it's 56 degrees. Your next news update in 30 minutes. For continuous coverage of the latest news, traffic, and weather, go to 560theanswer.com. I'm Elisa Z. Now more of Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Listen to AM 560, The Answer, online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, and your Alexa-powered smart speaker, on TuneIn, iHeart, and radio.com. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So climate change or land management, which is the proximate cause of the California wildfires? For a discussion on that topic, we're pleased to be joined by Bjorn Lomborg, who's the president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, the think tank, author of the recently released False Alarm, How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. Bjorn, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dan. It's great to be back.
So what's the problem in California, as you understand it, with these wildfires that are raging, and the entire Pacific Northwest, for that matter? The Joe Biden and the left say it's primarily a climate change issue.
Yeah, so everybody is telling us this is because of climate. And look, climate is a real problem, and it's something we should fix smartly. But it's phenomenally exaggerated when people are telling us that this is predominantly because of global warming. So if you look back in time, California used to burn much, much more. Over the last decade, about 1% of California burned every year. But back before Europeans, it used to be somewhere between 4 and 12% of the whole of California that burnt every year. It used to be totally smoky all summer, all fall. And yet this had obviously nothing to do with climate change. What has happened over the last 100 years is that California has basically suppressed fire. You've had very, very little fire. But what happens is you see enormous amounts of wood building up. And that is what is causing these big fires. Now, you basically have a lot of fire debt, fire that hasn't happened yet, but waits to happen and is now happening.
And so that would then logically follow that there should be more controlled burns than there have been. And the problem with doing more controlled burns is that those same climate change alarmists don't want controlled burns because that's against their religion.
Well, it's certainly a question of saying what will actually work. So look, it's reasonable to assume that climate change both dries out the wood more and that it also prolongs the fire season. But the vast majority of the reason we have more fires is because there's all this extra firewood that has been suppressed from burning for more than 100 years. So what you're essentially seeing is 5 times more dry wood in the forest cover now than it used to be. So clearly you're going to get more burning. You can do something about that by making sure that you actually do prescribed burns, as you rightly point out. If you do climate policy, you will have virtually no impact, even in 100 years. Remember, if not just California, but all of the U.S. stop using any CO2, stopped using any fossil fuels, stopped all their emissions tomorrow, and for the rest of the century, the UN climate panel models show us this would reduce temperatures by 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. You achieve nothing in 100 years.
Yeah,
what you can do is
sorry.
Go ahead.
No. But the left is arguing, but no, that all the underbrush, but then also they've had a drought. They've had a lot of, they've had a lack of rain in California, and they say that's part of climate change too.
And that's a fair argument that you could consider that in the long run you will probably see more drought. But what you have to remember is we used to have enormous amounts of droughts in California, and certainly when you go back, there were mega droughts that lasted for decades and one for more than a century. So there's clearly not a clear signal from climate change in the drought either. And again, even if you believe that there is, what can you realistically do about this? Well, if you imagine that you can manage to get all of the U.S. to stop emitting CO2 tomorrow and for the rest of the century, it will still get worse. It'll just get slightly less worse by the end of the century. You will have virtually no impact on fires. If you start prescribed burns tomorrow, you can actually fix this problem in a few years.
And our friend over at junkscience.com, Steve Malloy, makes the point, too. You not just, you're describing, eliminate all fossil fuels. This is how little you move the needle. $5 billion of cap and trade, cap and tax policy later, and now California has accomplished nothing. It's been $5 billion totally wasted in terms of carbon emissions as they have moved away from coal and want to move away from electricity.
Well, and I'm sorry, I don't know about how much California has spent and how successful they've been in reducing their emissions. But certainly, if we look both globally and if we look, for instance, at Germany and other countries, you can spend an enormous amount of resources and achieve almost nothing. Remember, for the last 10 years, the world has probably spent about $2 trillion on climate policies. Yet the UN Environment Program, they told us in a report last year, that they cannot tell the difference between the world that we're living in and a world where we had done nothing towards climate since 2005. So basically, we've spent $2 trillion and you can't tell the difference. That's important to recognize that if you go down the road and say, this is climate change, we're going to do something about climate change, we're going to mandate all kinds of things, you can easily waste lots of resources, but unfortunately, you will have very little or no impact.
And as we see in California, too, when you set arbitrary levels of how you're going, of the sources for your energy, like eliminating coal as a source and trying to move to solar and wind, a situation like this occurs with the grid, and now Eric Garcetti, the mayor of L.A., is talking about rolling blackouts, which is nothing new in California.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, if you don't have reliable backup power, so basically baseload power that you can rely on all the time, you are likely to see blackouts. And what we're seeing right now is that you're shutting down, for instance, nuclear power plants, which no matter what you think about nuclear power, you can have a conversation about whether you should put up new nuclear power, but you've already built it. You've already paid for it. You still have to decommission it. Why wouldn't you let it run? And they run very cheaply while they're built. Why wouldn't you let it run, have CO2-free power, and have lots of baseload power instead of having to rely mostly on unreliable solar and wind?
And you know, I've read some of your colleague Michael Schellenberger's writings on this topic as well recently. He's talked to forest professionals in California, land management experts, and they all say the same thing that you're saying, that Schellenberger's saying. Individuals who've studied the environment and climate change for some decades now. And yet there's no interest in that discussion among policymakers in California, as was so indicated when Trump went out to visit with Gavin Newsom and his cabinet members. So why is that?
Well, I think there's a lot of this that comes down to, are you virtue signaling or are you actually trying to solve a problem? If you want to solve the problem that there are fires that endanger people's lives and certainly make life very uncomfortable, then you would look at what works. What are the things, what are the policies that we could do that would actually help? And very clearly, all the experts, as you mentioned, will tell you prescribed burns is one of the best ways to make sure you get less fire. You fundamentally can't have a place that used to burn a lot every year suppress fire for more than a century and expect everything is going to be fine. That's the simple answer. But of course, if what you want is rather to virtue signal, feel good about yourself, then it is very obvious to use this, as many other things, as an indicator for global warming. And again, remember, global warming is a real problem. But by making it the only issue that you focus on, by making it the magic knob that you always can turn and then make all problems go away, not only are you exaggerating the science dramatically, but you're also actually leading most people and policy down the wrong path. You're telling people we should invest in more solar panels when that will have negligible or zero impact on actual fire for the next century. Or you could focus on these things that are much less sexy and much less sort of demonstrative, but just would happen to work, namely prescribed fires.
And something else that's less sexy, but happens to be important, is the impact of energy policy on real people's lives in terms of their purchasing power in this country, in terms of their ability to have power in other countries. You've written extensively about this, and it's an area I really appreciate because you connect these policy choices to actual human beings in a way that sometimes we don't do a good job of. We talk in abstractions. The real world costs to actual human beings that don't have the means to have the choices of rich people, both in this country and around the world.
So we often forget that when you talk about doing climate policy, a lot of rich people in well-established elites will be thinking, oh, you can hike the gasoline price $1 or $20 or something. And that's easy if you live in Manhattan, where you probably don't even own a car. But obviously for many poor people, where the car is the way they actually can make their money and the way they can get to work, it is absolutely unconscionable to imagine that poor people who will be spending a much larger fraction of their resources on energy can absorb those kinds of costs. And that's, of course, why back in France a couple of years ago, the French president put on what was equivalent to a 13-cent hike on the price of gasoline per gallon. And that was what caused the massive protests that we know as the Yellow Vest protests. Basically, a lot of regular people who are saying, enough, I can't afford this. So it's easy when you're rich to say we should hike the price. But for most poor people, it actually have real-world impacts. And much more so if you look at the fact that, for instance, many people, so 29 million people are energy poor in the U.S., meaning that they cannot afford enough energy. That means that they have to make choices. They have to heat up their homes less in the winter. And we know that one of the things you die from, one of the most important ways you can die from temperature, is cold death. They actually outweigh heat death by a factor of 17 to 1 in the U.S. That matters because if you can't afford to heat your home, you will be more likely to die. We know that at least 11,000 people die from this very, very simple problem to solve. If you make energy prices too expensive, you have more people dying from cold.
Yeah, in Chicago, we only get roused by increases on soda here. Soda tax is what puts us over the edge.
That 3 cents was a killer. It was a boondoggle.
You go ahead.
I feel for you.
Yeah, well, I don't care if I'm cold in the winter, but if my Orange Crush costs 3 cents more, that's it. Taken to the streets. It's really excellent to connect those dots, and I wonder too, just sort of a philosophical question in part, but also a professional one since you're in the space. It seems to me, boy, the politicization of science that began with climate change, or maybe not began with climate change, but certainly has been dramatically increased because of all the money and attention and that's been focused on climate change. Boy, now that's transitioned to COVID-19 and science and public health professionals hyper-politicized, and it's really doing damage to the reputation of individuals in that space, like I believe it has done to so many climatologists and experts in the space of climate policy and atmospheric science?
I think and again, I think this is a very sensitive area. I would probably put it slightly differently. When we have this idea that because of our ideology or our politics, we know the answer, we are likely to be making much worse policy. And that's true both for COVID and for climate change. You should be listening openly to what actually works in the best possible way. How do you fix people dying from cold and heat deaths? How do you fix people from not dying and property not being burned up in California? These are simple empirical questions that we have good answers for, and we need to pick the policies that work the best, no matter what our political preference or our ideology dictate, if we actually want to make the most good for people. And I think on the same conversation, you need to discuss, for instance, should you lock down societies? What kind of impact should you have? I think there's evidence that for rich countries, moderate lockdowns make good sense. We know that for poor countries like India, but certainly for many countries in Africa, it makes absolutely no sense because the cost is just vastly bigger than the benefit. And so again, we need to have that conversation without being absorbed by this ideology conversation.
You're right. You did say it better than I did. Bjorn Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, author of the recently released False Alarm, How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. Bjorn Lomborg, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Dan, great to talk to, and Amy too.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit signaturebank.bank for your commercial